unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant the Masha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milind Vaishnav. India's once flourishing ties with Washington have soured in Trump's second term, marked by punishing tariffs and penalties over Russian oil. This turbulence reinforces New Delhi's instinct for multi-alignment and the desire to hedge between great powers rather than bet on any single partner. Against this backdrop, a new paper by the journalist and analyst James Crabtree argues that now is the time for Europe to shine and to make the case that it is India's most promising alternative in a shifting global order. The paper is called Pivot to Europe, India's Backup Plan in Trump's World, and it has just been published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, where James is a distinguished visiting fellow. James has spent 10 years as a journalist and foreign correspondent, notably for the Financial Times, where he served as the Mumbai bureau chief. He's the author of a much celebrated book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, published in 2018. He is currently a columnist for foreign policy and hard at work on a second book on the United States and Asia. To talk more about his new paper, I'm pleased to welcome James back to Grant the Masha. James, great to have you on.
Lovely to be here, Milan. Nice to see you.
So I want to provide our listeners with some context for your latest paper for ECFR, which we will link on our show notes. And I want to start with something that you say towards the front end of the paper. And I just want to quote, you say, since the early 2000s, India's approach to geopolitics has been akin to a cautious gambler, slowly putting more chips on America while also avoiding full commitment or forsaking entirely its earlier principle of non-alignment. Now, given what's happening in the news, it seems like the strategy worked pretty well until one fine day it didn't work so great. As you point out, U.S.-India relations have encountered stormy waters. The China challenge is only becoming more acute for India. But you argue that India should not double down on multi-alignment, doing more with Russia, mending fences with China, thinking about diversifying away from Western partnerships. And so I think this is where I'd like to start this conversation. Why should India not essentially double down on multi-alignment?
So I think the argument that we're trying to make is actually that India is going to do a different version of multi-alignment because its partnership with the United States has deteriorated. And the question is, well, what sort of multi-alignment is it going to do? There's a hole in India's foreign policy strategy. For the last 2 decades, India's dominant foreign policy strategy, not its only, but the main thrust has been to make the United States the most important diplomatic and strategic partner. And until about 3 or 4 months ago, that still seemed like a reasonable bet. I was in Delhi indeed with you, Milan, earlier this year at a Carnegie event, and the tone in Delhi was still one of quiet confidence that the relationship with the Americans could be made to work for all the reasons that your guests on this show have explained: the links between Trump and Modi, the sort of strategic rationale for the partnership, the mutually complementary technology relationship. All of that was still seen to stand. And those of us who were looking at this from Europe were a bit surprised by this, as in because I think Europe had been clobbered first by the new administration and therefore was, in a sense, more cautious about how it was going to be dealing with Trump in his second term. And I suppose it took a while for the new reality to hit the India-US bilateral. And so there's a hole there that needs to be filled. And so the question is, well, how do you fill that hole? And the argument that we're trying to make is that actually the logic behind India's foreign policy strategy was found that for India's economic development and security development strategy, the kind of partners that it needs most are high capacity, high technology, high income economies. They're not all European. I mean, that could be Israel or the GCC, or it could be Singapore. But a country like Russia doesn't give you as much of that. And therefore, as you're thinking about how you recalibrate your foreign policy to fill some of what you've lost from the United States, then the most capable partners are mostly high-income, high-technology democracies, and many of those are in Europe. And so that's in a sense the pitch that we're making, which is If you want to fill some of that hole that the Americans have left, then look to Europe first. Don't look to countries like Russia.
You are the first to acknowledge, and you do this at several points in your paper, that if you look back at the kind of historical record, Europe and India's relationship has often underperformed. And in your telling, it has been hampered by two things: differences in political priorities, as well as what you describe as often incompatible bureaucracies. And I wonder if you could just pause for a second on that and help us understand a bit better. In what ways have differing priorities and incompatible bureaucracies sort of placed a ceiling or a limit on cooperation between these two parties?
So if you go back to if you look at the decade prior to the Ukraine conflict, and I think for reasons we'll come on to, Ukraine has been a big moment of change in this for a number of reasons. But Europe was predominantly seen as an economic superpower without much strategic weight in the world. I mean, and I think the Indian security elite would admit that it looked to Europe principally for relations with Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, less so other European middle powers, and less so Brussels. And it simply took a while to realize that Europe was changing, both in the way that it looked at the world, particularly after Ukraine, but also that it was broadening institutionally. If you compare the relationship between Delhi and Europe, both the European capitals and in Brussels, with Washington, particularly over the last 5 years or so of the Biden administration and the late Trump administration, there was not only was there a lot of self-interest in a deeper US-India partnership, skepticism of China, India's desire for inward investment and technology transfer, there was also a very compatible bureaucracy. So the Indian National Security Advisor and the US National Security Advisor sort of sat at the middle of this bureaucratic nexus that was driving forward the partnership. On the European side, there was nothing like that. I mean, Brussels is a very difficult beast to deal with. There was what was called a Trade and Technology Council, which was set up between India and Europe, but it didn't work very well. It didn't work nearly as well as the American one did. There were a lot of missed connections. And so I think both you had, a Europe that was predominantly seeking to strike trade deals, and striking trade deals with India is quite difficult. It didn't have much to offer in the security and technology domain. And then you had this sort of problem of how do you actually interface these quite complex bureaucracies. I mean, Brussels and Delhi together are two labyrinthine beasts, and it was very difficult to get them to play nicely with one another until recently.
And when you look around the world today, the sense I get from your paper is that, you are clearly sensing that circumstances have shifted such that the ground today is much more fertile for closer Europe-India cooperation. Tell us a little bit about how you see the kind of emerging strategic convergence between India and Europe at this present moment in 2025.
Well, I think you have common concerns. To put Russia to one side, both Europeans and India are concerned about China, albeit in different respects. To common challenges in a big picture geopolitical sense. You do have a degree of complementarity, as in, Europe is a rich continent with technology. It has the same attributes as the United States, albeit not always in the same respect. It's not as strong a defense player as the US. It doesn't have mega-sized technology companies. But if you're looking around the world and thinking, where is it that advanced technology lives, then most of it is either in the United States, Europe, or Northeast Asia. I mean, that to some limited degree in a few other countries like Israel. So, there are things that Europe has that India wants. But I think the main driver is that there's this second common challenge, originally the common challenge with China, and now you have the same common challenge with the United States, which is that in both cases, the United States was the most important strategic partner that both Europe and India have. And in both cases, they're both coping with a degree of, sort of grief and mourning over how you now operate in a world in which the United States is not remains a very important partner, but operates in a much more transactional and coercive way than you've been used to, in ways that, you would rather it didn't operate. So you're trying to, as I said, you're trying to fill some of the gap that the US has been left. And so you look around and think, well, who else can we talk to? And so India has plenty of options. It's a very popular diplomatic partner. It's an enormous emerging market. Therefore, most global players seek improved relations with India. And until relatively recently, India had pulled off this remarkable trick of having pretty good relations with almost everybody. It's just that in the end, ultimately, in a fractured geopolitical environment, you couldn't keep that trick going forever.
It seems like, both India and Europe make references to a more fragmented multipolar order. But I wonder if the two are using the term in the same manner. So when they talk about emerging world order being more fragmented, being multipolar, moving away from the kind of American hegemonic moment, do they mean the same thing to both sides?
I think they're coming at it in slightly different ways. So for India, my sense from doing the research for this report, from the interviews that we did, was that multipolarity is almost entirely viewed as a good thing. That a more multipolar world, which includes, as Ashley Tellis's recent paper noted, a kind of contradictory element that necessarily involves a smaller role for the United States. But that gives India more space. It allows greater say in international affairs, more representation in international institutions, be they existing or emerging. And therefore, India welcomes the world of multipolarity. I think I would say for Europeans that they are almost resigned to a world of multipolarity. And in some ways, they see some advantages to it. But this is also a world that has some trepidation because, the world that existed between 1947 and wherever we would date its conclusion to over the last decade or so, was one in which Europe had a very privileged position, working as a close partner to the United States in the dominant political West. And therefore, the world that we're moving into, in which the West no longer has this dominant and privileged role, is one that leaves Europeans more nervous. So I think in a sense that that's the distinction. And maybe there's further distinctions that you might draw in which, Europeans hope that in a sense there will remain a more powerful role for the residual West than Indians might want. But anyway, I think there's a sort of convergence in the middle about a realization of the way that the world is moving. And I think in a sense you can see that. I remember at the event that we were at, one of our colleagues used a rather charming phrase, which is to say that Europe has overcome its problem of being strategically obnoxious, as in the high period of the rules-based international order, there was a tendency for Europeans to turn up in India and give lectures about minority groups and the decline of democracy and Kashmir and whatever it might be, in a way that used to really annoy, understandably, Indian elites who have a view that, we're very happy to talk to you and develop partnerships, but leave the internal management of our country to us. And I think Europe, as its own geopolitical position has worsened and as it has become more geopolitically realistic, has got out of that habit of in a sense, trying to behave in the way that a liberal internationalist would, and is now, in a sense, a more amenable partner because it no longer has that habit.
I want to go back, James, for a second to something that you alluded to earlier in this conversation, which is really the way in which kind of Europe has shifted or changed after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One of the things that you note in your report is that Europe's response to Russia's war has made it a more, quote unquote, geopolitically serious actor. And that, in turn, is a factor which makes Europe more attractive to India, particularly as the U.S. becomes a less generous or forthcoming defense and technology partner. For people who are not kind of steeped in Europe and the European Union, it can often be really difficult to try and separate the kind of rhetoric from the reality when it comes to European reform, right? What are the concrete signs that you can sort of point to, that we can point to, that show that, in fact, on a number of things, specifically, say, defense modernization, manufacturing, Europe is actually getting its house in order?
I'm glad you picked up on this point because I think it's a very important argument that we try to make in this report. generally speaking, people think that Ukraine was a problem for Europe-India relations. India has a historically important relationship with Russia, and Europeans at the time of the Ukraine invasion somewhat naively thought that because the Russian invasion was so obviously wrong, that all of our partners would sort of rush to the side of the Ukrainians. Some did. I used to live in Singapore, and Singapore, broadly speaking, supported what countries in Europe wanted it to do, but India didn't. And in actual fact, India, and particularly the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, got very fed up with Europeans assuming that everybody would simply rally to the Ukrainian cause because that was what was in Europe's interest. India has this heritage relationship with Russia, which isn't going to go away. It remains important for all sorts of reasons that we can talk about. So that was the predominant view, which is that Russia-Ukraine made a Europe-India relationship much more problematic, because any time Europeans talk to India, what they'd want to talk about is, well, why aren't you doing more on Ukraine? And India didn't really want to talk about this. And so it kind of created this barrier. I see it in a slightly different way, which is exactly as you put it in your introduction, which is that what the problem that Europe had, despite the fact that it is the more economically powerful, richer of the partners, is India didn't really take Europe seriously as a geostrategic actor. It saw it predominantly as this sort of peaceful free trade area, which was a nice place to go on holiday, or to take your business partners in the summer to go to the Wimbledon finals or the Saturday of the Lord's Test. But, in the real world of security and geopolitics, then, you talk to the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese if you had to. Ukraine changed that in an important respect. I mean, Europe is now a battle-hardened continent. It is rearming at a really substantial level. I mean, if you look at not just the top line NATO defense spending figures, 2.5%, 3%, but simply the amount of money that a country like Germany is beginning to spend on its military after it loosened its fiscal rules. You have all of the military learning that is coming from Ukraine. You have European strength in areas of security like cyber or space, where although nobody can quite match what Russia and China can do, you have real capabilities in Europe that are useful to India. So I think if you add all that together, the sort of the learnings from Ukraine, the new spending, the seriousness about a world that is geopolitically complicated, then you see a partner in not just in Brussels and Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President, but in the large European countries, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine itself, the ones that are really on the front line. These are kind of capable, geopolitically serious actors of the sort that India feels comfortable dealing with.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. You've spoken a bit about kind of what's changed with the U.S. and India and the U.S. and Europe. I want to now turn to the other element, which is the role of China. And, one of the things the report says is that China's rise and its continued kind of expansion has led New Delhi to play down hopes of deeper engagement with Beijing, right? But it seems like, at least in the past couple of weeks, we've sort of seen a bit of the opposite taking place. I mean, we know last week Modi had this friendly sit-down with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the SCO summit in China. The two also appeared with Vladimir Putin. It seems to me, having just come back from India a couple of weeks ago, there's an emerging consensus now that, look, India can't afford to shut out China, at least when it comes to trade and investment in kind of non-sensitive sectors. So I'm wondering if you agree. I mean, do you think actually the way things are panning out, we're set for a kind of prolonged thaw in China-India relations? Or do you think structurally there are real limits to what the two are going to be able to do, which is going to create a kind of sustained opportunity for Europe.
I think both of those things are true. So there is a thaw, albeit from a low base. And I think it is important to recognize how powerful the pictures from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit were. It's been quite a while since we have seen Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, and President Putin in one room together. They didn't all go to the BRICS summit recently in Brazil. And it is very clear when you see that people aren't wrong to think that this is an image of a new world order emerging with new institutions that are going to be increasingly powerful. These are very important relationships. And I do think that it is likely that there is going to be a thaw in India-China relations for exactly the reasons that you suggest. So there are things that could be very useful for India that China has to offer. Foreign investment, green transition technologies, a reasonably long list. And the relationship has been so bad over the last 5 years that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, not just visas and flights, but it'd be pretty easy for India to reopen or renege some of the technology restrictions, let TikTok back into the country, perhaps, accept a little bit of investment in these areas. So there's a lot of scope for a modest thaw. I think the question then becomes, how likely is that to become something more than that? And that's when you get into your point about structural long-term competition. It's very hard to tell, but I think, many of the voices that I talk to in Delhi are very skeptical about this. They feel that India and China, not just in the border, but in the Indian Ocean, in neighboring countries, are locked into a pattern of structural competition that will be quite hard to break. Equally, there are challenges with accepting some of what China has to offer. It creates potential dependencies that could be, weaponized or militarized in a future conflict scenario or a future tension scenario. I think people were very shocked in India when China turned off the rare earth taps recently, which didn't get as much press as the fact that they turned it off for Europe or the United States. But that was a real wake-up call, which is that, Beijing is perfectly willing to act in this way. And therefore, if you do accept investment, then that comes with risk. So I think that's the world that we're looking at. And a lot of it now depends on two factors that are uncertain. One is, to what extent is it possible for China to make good on its promise to be a partner and not a competitor? That promise by President Xi may have been meant sincerely, but over the last decade, that's not the pattern that you've seen. China has acted in a way that has consistently increased India's threat perceptions around the region, which is why, beginning from its re-entry into the Quad in the first Trump administration through to its ever closer relationship from the US, the fundamental driver of that is increased threat perceptions to do with China. So is it possible for China to behave in a way that systematically reduces those threat perceptions in order to create a space for greater competition? We'll see, but I think there are reasons to be doubtful about that. And then the second question is, how does President Trump behave? As in, is it possible to imagine that despite the damage that has been done over the last month or two, that the US system and the Indian system find a way through this so that the damage is limited and if not entirely repairable, then not on a kind of ever downward path? Again, unclear. There were some modest signs of this over the last week or so with the tweet exchange between Trump and Prime Minister Modi, but that's very early days. So I think you're exactly right. Modest thaw is what we're going to see. Whether it's going to turn into anything more, there are reasons to be doubtful. And within that context, this is the moment where, if you are an aspirant Indian partner, as the Europeans are, or it would be true also for Japan or the Republic of Korea or Australia or the GCC, this is your moment to try and go and, make your pitch, as it were.
I want to say something talk to you briefly about Russia, because, Russia is not a kind of the core focus of this piece, but you do bring it up at several points. I think it's worth just kind of pausing on it for a second. You have a kind of interesting warning or caution to our friends in Europe that I found quite interesting, and I was hoping to kind of draw you out on. You say that, look, Europeans need to understand that India's partnership with Russia is changing, and it is not the same relationship that, say, they had, from the Cold War. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about how, in your estimation, and why, furthermore, why is this relationship between India and Russia changing?
Well, if I were to put it very crudely, it is as India thinks about how to rebalance its multi-alignment strategy to replace the hole that is being left by the United States, it has some options. Europe is not the only one. And so with China has a lot to offer, but what it has to offer comes with very heavy strings attached. With Russia, the challenge is that actually Russia doesn't have as much to offer as it used to. So India used to see Russia as its predominant provider of technology, military support, and energy. Russia is not the technology leader. It's a declining economy. It still is an important military supplier, but nowhere near as important as it used to be. And that, you can see that if you look at the data. The proportion of Indian arms imports that come from Russia is consistently declining. That's partly because India aspires to better quality kit, but it's also because Russia is now an unreliable military supplier because many of its weapons are needed on the battlefield. Hence why India has diversified to countries like Israel and France in particular. That said, I think a lot of Europeans have been a bit naive because they misunderstand how important the Russia partnership remains. I mean, it wasn't an accident that when the real heart of this unfortunate diplomacy over the last 2 months, when Trump was doubling down on the tariffs and saying rude things, the first thing that Modi did was he called President Putin, and Jaishankar went to Moscow. And that, so there is a lot that India still gets out of this partnership. I suppose I would put it, my former boss at the IISS, John Chipman, used to say that countries should see their international partnerships as an investor would see a portfolio. And the question is, do you want to be overweight Russia or do you want to be underweight Russia? And India has historically been overweight Russia, and I think is in a process of, becoming more appropriately weighted. And in a sense, the task of other countries, particularly Europeans who would like India not to be such a close partner of Russia, is to say, well, maybe you should be underweight Russia and, we have something to offer, or we as the collective West have something to offer that is better than what you're going to get from your historic partnership with Russia.
I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, James, but I think one of the interesting dynamics right now in this whole kind of nadir of U.S.-India relations is that, I think Indians are quite happy to look for alternative oil suppliers outside of Russia. Prior to 2022, it's not as if they were taking in vast amounts of Russian crude. There was an opportunity, there was a change in the oil market, there was a good price on offer. And I think, if this were handled quietly behind closed doors, I think we could see India very easily make a pivot. I mean, is that your reading of the situation as well? That yes, obviously the defense relationship has a very long tail because even if India is diversifying towards Israel, Germany, the United States, France, and so on and so forth, because you have the stock of Russian equipment that need constant repair, resupply, maintenance, and so on and so forth, that pipeline is not going to shut off immediately. But when it comes to energy, it seems to me that there actually could be a reasonably quick pivot away from Russia, just as there was a reasonably quick pivot towards Russia.
Yeah, I agree with that completely, but it's very unlikely to happen if it's being handled as insensitively as it has been by the United States, as in if you in a sense threaten that you have to do this, then it puts everybody's backs up. So yes, I think that I've not got the impression that India or, Reliance Industries, the company that is doing most of the Russian refining, is unwilling to find alternative suppliers. There may be an economic hit to that because the Russian oil is often cheaper, but I think that they're willing to do that. But I think, to be honest, a lot of this is simply accidental, as in you're dealing with a White House that doesn't think terribly strategically about these things, and therefore the India relationship has become collateral damage to a short-term attempt to put pressure on Russia over Ukraine peace that was a function of what was happening in the Alaska meeting between Trump and Putin. And very unfortunate if you've been trying to build this strategic relationship between Washington and New Delhi over a 2-decade period, that it gets mangled for really, really quite tactical short-term reasons. But yes, I don't get the impression that India is absolutely wedded to its Russian crude. It saw a commercial opportunity and has done reasonably well out of it. But India will also point, as I'm sure many of your guests have pointed out, to the great hypocrisy of Europeans who are happy to take the refined Indian crude that comes from Russia. And this is the sort of, this is where you have these problems of double standards, which remain a kind of sticking point in a relation between India and some of its partners who've been critical of its role in this particular case as a refiner of Russian oil.
I mean, just as you were saying a moment ago, that there have been some signs in, I'd say, the past 5 to 7 days of a sort of calming of the storms that have existed between the U.S. and India. Trump had this kind of conciliatory tweet. Modi reciprocated. Your old newspaper, the Financial Times, reported, I believe, yesterday that on a phone call with European heads of state, Trump discussed the idea of, or encouraged them, I should say, to try and levy secondary sanctions on India for importing Russian oil. So there seems to be a bit of kind of cognitive dissonance going on, where on the one hand there seems to be a thaw, but then also a simultaneous ratcheting up, in different venues.
I mean, I think it's important to pause on this because it is. I mean, I don't want to be naive about this. There remain a different strategic interests in Europe and in India, and Ukraine is one of them. And so the bind that Europe finds itself in is that its predominant security threat is to the east. It worries about Russia and a wider Russia aggression, and it definitely doesn't want to see Ukraine forced to accept an unfair set of peace terms. And the Americans come to them and say, okay, well, if you want to put pressure on Russia, then we're willing to clobber China and India with 100% tariffs, but we're only going to do it if you do that. And of course, if Europe did that, then that would blow up its relationship with India, which it's been trying to develop. And so it's in a very complicated position. I mean, I in a sense, having written this paper, I hope that they find a way round this. But in a sense, they're trying to achieve two things at the same time. One is putting genuine pressure on Russia so that it will feel some pain for the way that it is acting, while not in particular damaging the relationship with India. There are other niggles, or more than niggles. The CBAM carbon adjustment mechanism is one, for instance, which has been a barrier to closer cooperation. But I think this is at the moment the biggest one. The risk of secondary sanctions would be the kind of thing that I think would have a very significant effect in Delhi and would make a much deeper kind of a trust building process of building a deeper partnership between India and Europe much more complicated.
So let's now pivot to this question of what exactly Europe and Europeans should be doing. And I just want to, again, read a bit of a selection from your piece where you write, as Europe urges India not to shift away from the West, it must do more to demonstrate its reliability as a partner. In particular, Europe must take care to avoid short-term policies that seek to win favor in Washington at the expense of its reputation with emerging partners elsewhere. I wonder if you could just spell out for us, James, in kind of concrete terms, what does this mean for the direction of European policy?
Well, so, I mean, when I wrote that sentence, this was exactly the example that I had in mind with the issue of secondary sanctions, where, there are often these complicated trade-offs. I mean, there may be others. I mean, there are lots of pressure that the US is putting on its partners in areas like technology regulation, but those may not have such a direct impact as the sanctions for oil. I mean, I think in terms in a broader term, if you look at what are the bases for a stronger Europe-India partnership, and again, this can happen at the Brussels level, or you can see it in some of the larger European states, in France, in Britain and Germany. It has a number of elements. So there's still trade. I mean, trade has been the traditional problem that we haven't got this trade deal done, but there is a lot of new determination to get a Europe-India trade deal done by the time of a long-awaited summit that's happening in the early part of next year. It's not impossible. The United Kingdom managed to get finally its trade deal with India over the line. Europe is more complicated, but nonetheless, that may happen. But I think the other areas are the technology partnership, which was really the way that the United States rebuilt and energized its partnership with India, was by refocusing it around technology investment and technology transfer. And Europe has a good deal to offer there. Economic security, which is supply chains and resilience, the common concern with Chinese coercion and an excessive reliance on Chinese supply chains. And defense and security, which is the area where, as we discussed earlier in this podcast, Europe traditionally, you had medium-sized European arms exporters in countries like Britain, France, Italy. But now Europe has a lot more to offer. It's spending a lot more, developing a lot more technology, looking for partners in new ways. And so I think if you add all of that up, you have the core of a very sort of interesting set of partnerships. And in this, this is a compliment that Europe is paying to the United States, because before Trump came along, really the US had been extremely imaginative in the way that it refashioned its partnership with the US through, various top-level initiatives and investments. And in a sense, what Europe needs to do is learn a little bit of the way that the US behaved during the first Trump and Biden administration, and not behave in the way that it is behaving in the second Trump administration.
I want to kind of pause for a second on this very tricky issue of kind of India's own kind of, commitment to kind of liberal democracy, right? When you come to the question of India's domestic transformations, Europe often, even more than the United States, stresses democracy, human rights. But your report suggests that, look, Europe may have to tone down its lectures, as you said before, to try and win back India's trust. How do you see them striking this balance between these deeply held values they believe are universal and this kind of, moment of realpolitik where, there's a battle out there and Europe wants India on side?
Yeah, and I think in the end what's happened is that Europeans have de-emphasized the issue of values in order to develop the partnership, as in, bigger fish to fry in a world in which you are anxious about the behavior of China and Russia. And, these are genuinely existential issues for the European project. Then you reprioritize what you're trying to do and with whom. And therefore, the European leaders of old who would come to Delhi and say, well, we want to do business, but we're also very worried about your declining economic institutions, and had this slightly sort of school matronly function of wagging fingers. And, all of that is true, but, or at least there are sort of elements of truth to it. But I think, this is just a moment of geopolitical awakening where you have to learn to respect a world in which there are plural systems of government. And, the way that India sees world order is different from the way that Europe used to, in the sense that, in common with China, non-interference in domestic affairs is a kind of precursor for any arrangement. And therefore, I think it just took Europeans a while, and Americans too, a while to come round to that fact. Trump isn't bothered about what is agnostic between democracies and dictatorships or authoritarian systems. Sometimes appears to prefer authoritarian systems. Europe clearly, still in common with the democracies of Northeast Asia, has a preference. I mean, it wants still to have partners who share its values, but when push comes to shove, that's not always possible, and therefore you have to be a little bit more practical about the way that you're building ties and being respectful of other systems and other beliefs.
I mean, I think maybe a good way of kind of bringing this to a close, James, is to kind of ask you to reflect a bit on the various factors that could derail the sort of close collaboration that you envision, right? And it's something that you're not blind to at all in the paper. You take it on directly. Let's maybe start first with Europe. What, to your mind, are the barriers to cooperation you foresee on the European side?
I think there's a narrow window of opportunity at the moment where, in a sense, the constellation has come together. You have a high-level political commitment to move this forward, heading into this summit early next year, and you have two players who are alarmed not just by China's continuing behavior, but by the US. But it's always possible for these things to be bureaucratically derailed. Both sides are complicated to deal with. Europe in particular it has nearly 30 member states at the European Union level, and therefore there's always divisions about what the priorities should be and where the political capital is going to be spent. We're speaking a day after Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, gave a very stark speech yesterday, the State of Europe address that she gives from time to time, which painted a very bleak picture of the world that Europe faces and all of the challenges that it faces. And they only have so much political capital to spend. So I think it is possible to imagine a world in which Europe's leaders decide that they need to spend that in a way that would not be as conducive to building a partnership with India. And I suppose part of the reason for writing this paper is to argue that would be a mistake. And I think at the moment, anyway, the people who are around von der Leyen and they seem to be still heading in a direction of putting serious energy behind this partnership and trying to get it over the line.
And when you look at it from the Indian side, I mean, what are the potential stumbling blocks or barriers that you see from New Delhi's point of view?
Well, I think, in a sense, I am not here to tell policymakers in Delhi that I know their self-interest better than they do. And they will, those in the security establishment and elsewhere in the Indian government will look at the world and work out what is in India's national interest. And, they may decide that a broader rapprochement with China, the short-term benefits are worth the long-term costs. Or they may look at a partnership with Russia and think, although this is not a partnership which offers as much as it used to in the technology domain or in the military domain, look, President Putin is the kind of person that we can do business with, and we trust him, and we'll move forward with that. So I think that any political ecosystem has competing voices, and those in New Delhi who have been big advocates of the American partnership are now understandably on the back foot, and those who, in a sense, have previously advocated for closer ties with old partners like Russia are going to be having a moment, and therefore there will be a debate and an argument going on, as we said right at the beginning of this discussion. India is not throwing away multi-alignment. The question is, what sort of multi-alignment is India moving to? How does it fill this American hole? And I think it is possible that the people in India will look at the world in a way that is simply different from the way that we might look at it in Europe. But I hope not.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist and analyst James Crabtree. He is the author of a new report called Pivot to Europe, India's Backup Plan in Trump's World. It's just been published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, where James is a visiting fellow. I also want to commend to our listeners a recent Foreign Policy magazine column that James authored called Why India Should Not Walk into the China-Russia Trap. It's something that has been doing the rounds amongst the policy elite. James, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grantamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.